The desert sun baked the airfield tarmac, turning it into a wavy, shimmering mirage that hovered just above the ground. On the edge of this vast expanse of concrete and heat stood a single-story, unremarkable building, its windows tinted to reflect the relentless glare. Inside, the hum of climate control was a constant, low thrum, a sound so pervasive the inhabitants no longer noticed it, a auditory blanket smothering the distant, occasional roar of jet engines. This was the Aeronautical Systems Engineering Wing, a place of quiet calculation, of fluorescent lights and the soft click of keyboards. And in a corner office, surrounded by 3 large monitors displaying cascades of complex code, sat Alara Vance. She was a woman who seemed made for the silence of this place. In her early 40s, her face was pleasant but unassuming, the kind of face that easily blended into a crowd. Her hair, a shade of brown that hinted at former gold, was pulled back in a simple, practical ponytail. She wore functional glasses and a plain, comfortable cardigan over her clothes, a uniform of anonymity. Her entire being projected a desire to be overlooked, to be a ghost in the machine she served. For 12 years this had been her life, her sanctuary. She was known, to the few who knew her at all, as brilliant, reclusive, and pathologically private. The younger engineers sometimes whispered that she must have burned out in some spectacular corporate meltdown, fleeing to the government for a quieter life. They couldn't have been more wrong. Her long fingers danced across the keyboard, not with frantic energy, but with a precise, economical grace that spoke of deep, ingrained knowledge. She was debugging a new flight control algorithm, her focus absolute, her world narrowed to the logic gates and variables on the screen. This was where she was safe. Here, in the realm of pure data, there were no G-forces, no screaming engines, no gut-wrenching decisions made in a split second at the edge of the sky. There was only cause and effect. Input and output. A shadow fell across her doorway. Major Jack Dillon, commander of the 94th Fighter Squadron, filled the space. He was everything Alara was not. Broad-shouldered, loud, his flight suit worn like a badge of honor, his posture radiating a cocksure confidence that came from years of commanding the most powerful fighter jet ever built. He looked around the quiet office with an expression of faint disdain, as if he'd walked into a library of irrelevancy. "Vance," he said, his voice cutting through the hum. It wasn't a question. Alara flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible spasm of her shoulders, before she slowly turned her chair. "Major Dillon, what can I do for you?" Her voice was soft, neutral, carefully stripped of any emotion that might invite further conversation. He stepped in holding a data tablet. "This new patch. Your team cooked it up. We're running the sims this afternoon before a live exercise. You signed off on it." He said it like an accusation. "I did," she said calmly. "It passed all my diagnostic checks. It's a solid update to the envelope protection system." Dillon grunted, swiping on the tablet. "Maybe. Seems redundant. The bird's got more than enough safeguards. This just feels like padding. A solution looking for a problem." He looked at her, his eyes scanning her cardigan, her glasses, her placid face. He saw a bureaucrat. A paper pusher. Alara took a slow breath. "With all due respect, Major, it's not padding. The F-22's flight control system is incredibly complex. This patch addresses a very specific, very rare potential fault line in the interaction between the pitch and yaw systems during high-G maneuvers at the absolute edge of the performance envelope. It's a preventative measure." Dillon waved a dismissive hand. "A potential fault. A rare one. You code folks live in a world of what-ifs. We live in the sky. The jet is fine. It's more than fine. It's a masterpiece." His tone was patronizing, the expert talking down to the theorist. A flicker of something, frustration, memory, passed behind Alara's eyes so quickly it was gone before it could be registered. "Masterpieces can have flaws, Major. Especially when new variables are introduced. This patch is a necessary contingency." "Necessary according to you?" he countered, a smirk playing on his lips. "Look, I appreciate your diligence. But my pilots and I know this aircraft inside and out. We don't need a software nanny." He used the term deliberately, a small, condescending barb meant to put her in her place. Alara looked away from him, back to her screen. The code seemed to blur for a second. She saw not just variables but clouds, the curve of the Earth from 60,000 feet, the feel of a stick in her hand. She forced the image away. That was not her life anymore. "It's your squadron, Major," she said, her voice even quieter now, a clear dismissal. "The recommendation is logged. The decision is yours." "Damn right it is," Dillon said, satisfied he'd asserted his authority. He tapped the tablet. We're loading it now. I'm sure it'll be fine. Probably won't even notice it's there. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. Keep up the good work, at the desk. And with that final petty jab, he was gone, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hall before being swallowed by the ever-present hum. Alara didn't move. She sat perfectly still in her chair, staring at the lines of code on her monitor without seeing them. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, hidden under the desk. The quiet of her office, once a comfort, now felt heavy, oppressive. She could still hear the echo of his arrogance, the sheer, unthinking confidence that came from never having been truly, catastrophically wrong. She had tried to warn him. She had done her job. She had spoken the truth, and it had been brushed aside like a minor irritation. Slowly, deliberately, she unclenched her fists and placed her hands back on the keyboard. She immersed herself back in the silent, logical world of the algorithm. It was safer there. It had to be. But for the first time in a long time, the silence felt fragile, a thin pane of glass over a very deep, very dark well of memory. She had a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, a ghost of a sensation from a past life she had tried desperately to bury. It was the feeling of something terrible about to happen. The air atop the world was a different kind of substance, not the thick, soupy atmosphere of the ground but a thin, crystalline medium, bitterly cold and scouring clean. Here, at 60,000 feet, the sky was a profound, darkening blue, a shade away from the black of space, and the sun was a fierce, unwavering point of light, undiffused, casting sharp, long shadows across the cloud tops that lay like a frozen cotton ocean miles below. Two F-22 Raptors, their angular forms seeming to drink the light, carved silent, perfect arcs through this immense emptiness. They were not so much flying as existing in a state of controlled, supreme velocity, a ballet of physics and raw power. Inside the lead jet, call sign Raptor 1-1, Major Jack Dillon felt a familiar surge of ownership. This was his domain. The jet, an extension of his will, the sky, his personal kingdom. In the rear seat, Lieutenant Ben Carter, his WSO, monitored the complex web of sensors and systems, his voice calm and professional through the intercom. Systems nominal, Reaper. Telemetry link is solid. New patch is running. No anomalies. Dillon smirked inside his oxygen mask. Of course there were no anomalies. The jet was flawless. Vance's worries were the phantom fears of someone who lived in the theoretical, who had never truly flown. The exercise was straightforward, a high-altitude intercept simulation. The two Raptors were the hunters, tracking a data-linked signal from a distant B-52 acting as a lumbering proxy for a threat. It was a drill they had run 100 times. Dillon pushed the throttles forward, the twin Pratt & Whitney engines answering with a subdued, powerful rumble that was felt more than heard inside the pressurized cockpit. The aircraft accelerated smoothly, a predator closing in. "All right, Chip," Dillon said using Carter's call sign. "Let's run the new protocol. Activate the simulated threat response on my mark." Carter's fingers danced across his touch screens, calling up the specific subroutine that was part of the new software patch. "Ready, Reaper. Mark." Dillon initiated a high G turn, pulling the sleek aircraft into a tightening arc that would position them for a perfect missile solution. For a heartbeat, everything was as it should be, the smooth pressure of the turn, the seamless flow of data on their displays, the quiet hum of a machine operating at the peak of its potential. Then the world exploded into chaos. It began not with a bang but with a flicker. Carter's primary navigation screen stuttered, the crisp moving map dissolving into a hash of green and black pixels for a fraction of a second before returning to normal. Reaper NAV glitch," he reported, his tone still calm, troubleshooting. Before Dillon could respond, a master caution light flashed on his main panel, accompanied by a sharp, electronic warning tone. "What the hell?" Dillon growled, scanning his instruments. The flight control system was reporting a cascade of failures. The stick in his hand, usually alive with the subtle feedback of the fly-by-wire system, went dead, then sloppy, then dead again. It felt like trying to steer a boat with a rope. "I've got flight control errors. Multiple systems." Carter's voice was tighter now, laced with an edge of urgency. "Comms are down. I'm losing data link. Primary and secondary radios are dead. It's like everything is just shutting down." The mighty Raptor was suddenly a wounded bird. The smooth roar of the engines became a ragged, uneven shudder as the failing computers mismanaged fuel flow and thrust. The horizon on Dillon's head-up display, once rock-steady, began to tilt and spin lazily. The aircraft started a slow, sickening roll to the right, its nose beginning to drop. Dylan fought the controls, his muscles straining, but it was like fighting a ghost. The inputs he made seemed to have little to no effect. The jet was no longer listening. It was falling. The serene blue of the high sky was now a vast, terrifying prison. The cloud deck below, once so beautiful, rushed up to meet them with terrifying speed. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at the edges of Dylan's consciousness. He was a master pilot, but he was a master of a functioning machine. This was a systemic, total failure. He was along for the ride, and the ride was a descent into oblivion. In the back seat, Ben Carter was fighting his own battle. Fear was a live wire in his gut, but his training was a deeper, more powerful force. His eyes scanned the panoply of dead and dying screens. Every system was redlining or offline entirely. They were deaf, dumb, and blind, falling out of the sky in the most advanced fighter ever built. His breathing was loud in his mask, each gasp of oxygen a conscious effort. Then his eyes fell on one last, desperate option. The emergency survival radio, a separate, battery-powered UHF set designed for one thing only, to call for help after ejecting. It was their last link to the world. His hand, encased in a flight glove, shook slightly as he keyed the mic. The channel was preset to the international distress frequency. He took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing his voice into a semblance of calm professionalism, a stark contrast to the screaming chaos of their situation. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Raptor 1-1, declaring an emergency. He paused, listening to nothing but static. We are experiencing total systems failure. I say again, total systems failure. Flight controls non-responsive. Navigation and comms offline. We are in an uncontrolled descent. He repeated the call, his voice becoming a metronome of dread in the screaming silence of the cockpit. He knew they were just a voice shouting into a hurricane, but it was the only thing left to do. He described the failure not in the simple terms of a pilot, but with the precise technical language of a systems operator, detailing the specific sequential collapse of the aircraft's nervous system, a final, detailed testament to what was going wrong as they fell. The Emergency Operations Center was a tomb of organized panic. The large, central screen that usually displayed the friendly, ordered chessboard of training exercises was now a stark, terrifying picture. Two icons for the F-22’s, one for Raptor 1-2 holding a steady orbit, and one for Raptor 1-1, was not moving in any purposeful way. It was simply falling. A cold, digital representation of a nightmare. The data stream beside it was a waterfall of crimson text and flashing warnings, a relentless scroll of failure codes that made no sense to the controllers staring at it. The air, usually cool and filtered, felt thick and electric with dread. Voices were low, tense, clipped. The loss of an aircraft was a professional tragedy. The loss of a crew was a visceral, gut-wrenching horror that every person in the room trained to prevent but secretly prayed they would never face. The door hissed open and General Helen Walsh strode in. Her presence was like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. The low chatter died instantly. Her face, usually a mask of composed authority, was grim, her eyes fixed on the tragic ballet of the falling icon on the screen. "Status," she commanded, her voice cutting through the hum of servers and the soft pings of alarms. A senior controller, his face pale, answered without looking away from his console. "No comms, General. Total blackout. Telemetry is gone. All we have is their last transmitted position and descent rate. They're in a flat spin or an uncontrolled dive. We can't tell. Ejection." He trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the air. Ejection might not be possible. The systems might be too dead. "Get me a fix on their emergency survival radio," Walsh ordered, her voice iron. "Saturate the area. Every listening post, every satellite, everything we have. I want to know if they're talking." The room erupted into a new flurry of activity, technicians calling out coordinates, trying to triangulate a ghost of a signal. Minutes ticked by, each one an eternity measured in thousands of feet of lost altitude. The sense of helplessness was a physical weight in the room. They were watchers on the shore, witnessing a ship sink in a storm, utterly powerless to affect the outcome. Then a young airman at a far console stiffened. "Wait, I've got something." Faint, breaking up. "It's on the guard frequency." A hush fell over the room. The general leaned forward. "Put it on speaker." A burst of static crackled through the overhead speakers, then a voice, strained but remarkably clear, etched with a terrifying calm. Asterisk, "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Raptor 1-1, declaring an emergency. Total systems failure, flight controls non-responsive, uncontrolled descent." Asterisk, it was Lieutenant Carter's voice. The message repeated, a loop of desperation from the edge of the void. It was a voice from a coffin falling at terminal velocity. The room listened, mesmerized and horrified. They had a voice now, but it changed nothing. They could hear the dying, but they couldn't save them. The technical details Carter recited were a foreign language to most, a eulogy written in code. It was standard procedure to summon the engineering team for a crash investigation, and in a desperate, futile hope that they might somehow understand the problem, a runner was sent to bring them up. Minutes later, a small group of civilian engineers, led by a pale and shaken department head, filed into the back of the room. They looked like ghosts themselves, out of place amidst the military uniforms, their faces masks of shock and professional curiosity warring with human fear. Among them, almost hidden, was Alara Vance. She stood slightly apart, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed not on the generals or the controllers, but on the speaker from which Carter's voice continued its grim, repeating broadcast. At first she was just another stunned observer. But as Carter's voice detailed the specific failures for the third time, primary flight control system failure, sequential reboot failure on the FBW bus, navigation database corruption, something shifted in her posture. The tight, defensive hunch of her shoulders relaxed into a straight, attentive line. Her head, which had been bowed, came up. Her eyes, usually hidden behind the reflection of her glasses, now gleamed with a fierce, sharp intelligence. The vague, distant look was gone, burned away by a concentration so intense it seemed to draw all the light and sound in the room toward her. She was no longer listening to a distress call, she was parsing data. She was absorbing the symptoms and cross-referencing them against a vast internal library of knowledge. The department head was wringing his hands. "It's the new patch." Dylan loaded it. "My God, it must have a bug we didn't catch. A nested loop, maybe, something that..." He was babbling, overwhelmed by the scale of the catastrophe. Alara didn't hear him. Her mind was elsewhere, racing through lines of code, through system architectures, through failure trees she had mapped out years ago. She saw it. She saw the exact flaw, the precise cascade. It wasn't just a bug, it was a perfect storm of arrogance meeting a neglected variable. And in that instant she also saw the solution. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance. A tiny sliver of a chance buried deep within the machine's crippled architecture. The general was speaking. "Is there anything at all we can transmit to them? A procedure? A reset sequence?" The engineers looked at each other, hopeless. The systems were too integrated, too complex. Any instruction would be like trying to perform brain surgery with a radio instruction manual. Alara moved. It wasn't a rush, not a dramatic charge. It was a decisive, purposeful stride that cut through the crowd of stunned onlookers. She walked directly to the central communication station where a terrified young airman sat, a headset half off his ear, staring at the console as if it were on fire. Without a word, without asking permission, Alara reached down and gently took the headset from his hands. He looked up at her, too surprised to protest. She ignored the stunned looks from the generals, the confused glances from the engineers. She adjusted the microphone, her movements economical and sure. She keyed the mic. Her voice, when it left her lips, was utterly transformed. The soft, hesitant tone was gone. It was cool, clear, authoritative, and laced with an undeniable urgency that commanded absolute attention. It was the voice of someone used to being obeyed in a crisis. "Raptor 1-1, this is Tower Auxiliary. Your flight control failure is a nested loop error in the pitch stability system. I read your signal. I need you to listen very carefully." The voice that cut through the static-filled silence of the crippled F-22's cockpit was not just a sound. It was an anchor thrown into a hurricane. In the back seat, Lieutenant Ben Carter, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges of his dead console, felt his heart lurch. The voice was female, calm, and carried an authority that was absolute, a stark, almost surreal contrast to the screaming dissonance of the failing aircraft and the roaring panic in his own mind. It wasn't the voice of a panicked controller or a distant, fuzzy command. It was the voice of someone who knew, with utter certainty, exactly what was happening inside their dying machine. "Raptor 1-1, this is Tower Auxiliary. Your flight control failure is a nested loop error in the pitch stability system. I read your signal. I need you to listen very carefully." In the front seat, Major Dylan, wrestling with the unresponsive stick, his breath coming in ragged gasps, heard it too. His first reaction was a surge of fury. A civilian? A desk jockey? But the tone, the specific technical diagnosis, nested loop error, it was too precise, too confident to be ignored. It was a lifeline and they were drowning. "Tower Auxiliary, Raptor 1-1, Carter responded instantly, his voice tight but focused now, a soldier given an order. "We are listening. Go ahead." The voice, Ilara's voice though they did not know it, began to speak again, and her words were a strange and beautiful language of salvation. "The error has cascaded into the primary flight control computer and is preventing a clean reboot. You need to force a hard reset on the secondary power distribution bus. This is a manual override. Do you copy?" "See copy," Carter stammered, his eyes frantically scanning the jungle of switches and circuit breakers around him. "Manual override on the secondary bus. What is the location?" "I don't have visuals. My screens are down." The helplessness threatened to swamp him again. The voice was imperturbable. "Acknowledged. The panel is on your lower left console. You are looking for a guarded red switch. It is labeled as EC bus PWR cutoff. The guard is black. Do you see it?" Her instructions were not a question but a guided path, each word a step out of the darkness. Carter's head swiveled, his gloved hands sweeping across the panel. The vibration of the aircraft was so violent it was hard to focus. Then he saw it. "I see it. I have it." "Good," the voice said, its cadence never changing, a metronome of calm in their chaos. "Now listen. You must lift the guard and hold the switch in the override position for a full 5 seconds. You will hear a series of internal relays disengage. The cabin lights will likely flicker. This is normal. Do not release until you hear the third click. Confirm." Dylan, who could only listen, could only fight the dead stick, felt a bizarre dislocation. This person wasn't just giving instructions, she was in the cockpit with them. She knew the sound the relays would make. She knew the rhythm of the reset. Who was this? Carter's hand closed around the switch. His world had narrowed to this single point. The voice, the switch, the count. He lifted the guard. "Ready. Execute now," the voice commanded. He pushed the switch. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then a loud clunk echoed through the airframe. The dim emergency lights in the cockpit died completely, plunging them into utter blackness for a heart-stopping second. Dylan grunted in shock. Then another clunk and the lights flickered back on, weak and unsteady. Carter held his breath, his arms straining, his whole being focused on the voice in his headset. The jet continued its sickening fall. The third clunk was softer, more internal. He released the switch. For 3 long seconds, there was only the whistle of wind and the shudder of the airframe. Then, a miracle. The main instrument panel, which had been a tombstone garden of dead screens and flashing red lights, flickered. One screen stuttered to life, then another. Lines of green text scrolled rapidly as systems began a painful automated reboot sequence. The stick in Dylan's hand, which had been a dead weight, suddenly twitched. It was a faint, ghostly sensation, but it was feedback. The fly-by-wire system was clawing its way back online. "Systems are rebooting," Carter yelled, his voice cracking with a mixture of shock and elation. "I have partial hydraulics. I have basic attitude indicators. Reaper, can you feel that?" Dylan could feel it. It was like feeling a pulse return to a numb limb. The jet was no longer a corpse. It was a patient in critical condition, but alive. "I've got something. It's weak, but I have control response." He pulled back gently on the stick. The nose, which had been pointed at the ever-approaching Earth, began agonizingly slowly to rise. The voice returned, its work not yet done. "Raptor 1-1, your primary controls will be degraded. You are on backup systems. Your airspeed is critical. Do not exceed 300 knots. Do not attempt any maneuvers over 2 gs. Your landing gear and flaps may not respond. You are coming in heavy and fast. Do you have a visual on the field?" Carter, his hands now flying across the screens that were slowly repopulating with data, found the navigation data was still corrupted. Negative. Negative on NAV data. We are blind." The voice didn't hesitate. "Acknowledge. Stand by for bearing." There was a brief pause, the only time the transmission held any silence at all. Then the voice returned, reciting a series of numbers, a heading, a distance, an altitude. It was like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. "Fly heading 270. Descend and maintain Angels 5. You will have visual on the runway in approximately 20 miles. Dylan, his jaw clenched with a concentration he had never before needed to muster, obeyed. He banked the wounded jet onto the new heading, his movements delicate, precise, a world away from his usual aggressive flying. He was nursing a crippled giant home. The ground, which had been a blur of terrifying detail, began to recede slightly as he leveled off. The cloud tops were gone. They were in the thick, turbulent air of lower altitude. And then ahead through the haze he saw it, the long thin scar of the runway. A sight he had seen 1,000 times, but never had it looked so beautiful, so impossibly precious. The voice guided them through the final, treacherous approach, calling out airspeed, sink rate, adjustments. It was the most precise, nerve-wracking landing of Jack Dillon's life. The wheels screeched on the tarmac, the aircraft shuddering violently as the limited braking systems fought to slow its immense weight. Finally, with a last, protesting shudder, the F-22 rolled to a stop at the very end of the runway. In the sudden, deafening silence that followed the engine shutdown, Dillon and Carter sat motionless in their seats, breathing in ragged, heavy gasps. The adrenaline crash was immense. They were alive. Against all odds, against a certain death sentence, they were alive. Over the crackle of the emergency radio, the voice spoke one last time, "It's job done. Raptor 1-1, secure your aircraft. Emergency crews are en route." The transmission cut out. Carter, overwhelmed, his hands still shaking, keyed his mic. His voice was thick with emotion. "Tower Auxiliary, ma'am, who are you? You just saved our lives." There was no immediate answer, only the static hiss of the open channel, a void where a miracle had just been. The silence that followed the end of the transmission was not empty, it was thick, heavy, and vibrating with the aftershock of the impossible. In the Emergency Operations Center, no one moved. They were statues frozen in the moment, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly agape, all staring at the woman who had just single-handedly pulled 2 men back from the brink of death with nothing but her voice and her mind. Elara Vance stood perfectly still at the communications console, the headset now loose in her hand. The fierce, commanding light that had animated her features was gone, extinguished as suddenly as it had appeared. The color had drained from her face, leaving her pale and visibly shaken. She slowly, almost reluctantly, placed the headset back on the console as if it were a red-hot piece of iron. The transformation was jarring. The Oracle was gone, and the quiet, unassuming engineer had returned, looking small and exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights and the weight of a dozen stunned stares. The spell was broken by the sound of the door bursting open. A team of crash trucks, fire engines and medical vehicles, their lights painting the walls in frantic pulses of red and white, screamed past the building toward the distant runway. The noise was a physical assault after the tense quiet of the center. It broke the paralysis. The senior controller found his voice first, a hoarse whisper into the sudden commotion. "She did it? My God, she actually did it." The room erupted into a low, buzzing hum of disbelief and relief. Technicians were clapping each other on the back, some sinking into their chairs, their hands over their faces, the adrenaline draining away to be replaced by a giddy, overwhelming exhaustion. But amidst the relieved chaos, one man was not celebrating. An older air traffic controller named Mike, a man with a face like a weathered map and 30 years of watching skies, hadn't moved from his station. He was staring at Elara with an expression of deep, profound confusion that was slowly curdling into dawning recognition. He had been listening not just to the words, but to the cadence, the specific, unhesitating technical jargon, the cool, unwavering authority in the face of total systems failure. It was a style he hadn't heard in over a decade. A ghost from a different era of aviation. He turned slowly to the younger controller next to him, his voice barely a whisper, meant for no one else, but it carried in the sudden quieting of the room. "That sounded like reverb," he murmured, his eyes never leaving Elara's back as she tried to shrink away from the attention. "The cadence. The way she called out that bearing. I haven't heard her read out like that since. I thought she was gone. I thought she was long gone." The name meant nothing to the younger man, who just shook his head in confusion. But it meant everything to the few other veterans in the room, whose heads snapped up at the whispered call sign. Their eyes, too, locked onto Elara, seeing her not as a civilian engineer, but as a legend suddenly made flesh. It was at that precise moment that General Helen Walsh decided to move. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a commanding, urgent curiosity. She had witnessed a miracle and she needed to understand its source. Her sharp eyes had caught the veteran controller's whisper, seen the reaction it provoked. She strode across the room, her boots clicking decisively on the tile floor. The crowd of engineers and airmen parted for her instinctively. She stopped directly in front of Elara, who seemed to be trying to make herself disappear into her cardigan. "Elara," the general said, her tone not harsh but firm, demanding an answer. "What just happened here?" Elara didn't look up. She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture. I just utilized the system manuals, General. The emergency procedures are quite clear if you know where to. Don't Walsh interrupted, her voice dropping lower, becoming almost gentle but leaving no room for argument. Don't insult what I just witnessed by calling it a manual procedure. No manual written has the answer for what just happened out there. That was instinct. That was experience. That was the kind of knowledge that only comes from being in the cockpit. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. She leaned in slightly. Mike over there seems to think he recognized your voice. He mentioned a name. A call sign from a long time ago. Reverb. The name hung in the air between them. Ilara flinched as if she'd been struck. Her head jerked up, and for the first time, her eyes met the general's. In them, Walsh saw a flash of pure, unadulterated panic before a wall of forced calm slammed down. But it was too late. The reaction was all the confirmation Helen Walsh needed. Her own eyes widened, her professional composure cracking for just a second to reveal sheer astonishment. The pieces clicked into place with an almost audible snap. The brilliance, the reclusiveness, the aversion to the flight line, the deep, intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that went far beyond theory. My God, General Walsh breathed, the words full of awe and dawning understanding. Ilara Vance. It is you. She wasn't asking any more. She was stating a rediscovered fact. After all these years. The entire room had gone utterly silent again, every person straining to hear this incredible, unfolding revelation. The quiet civilian engineer was someone. She was a ghost with a legendary name. And she had been hiding in plain sight all along. The walk from the operations center to General Walsh's office was the longest of Ilara Vance's life. It wasn't the physical distance. It was the terrifying chasm between the life she had meticulously built for 12 years and the past that had just been violently exhumed for everyone to see. She walked a step behind the general, her head down, feeling the weight of every stare from every airman and officer they passed. Whispers seemed to coil around her like smoke. That's her. She's the one who talked them down. Did you hear? They're saying she's Reverb. The name, once a badge of honor, now felt like a brand, searing her with a shame she had tried so desperately to outrun. She kept her eyes fixed on the polished linoleum floor, watching the distorted reflections of the fluorescent lights glide by, each one a reminder of the glaring exposure she now endured. General Walsh's office was a reflection of the woman herself. Orderly, professional, and imposing. A large desk of dark wood was neat and tidy, the walls adorned with framed photographs of aircraft and formal unit portraits. Walsh closed the door behind them, and the sound of the latch clicking into place was deafeningly final. The cacophony of the base was reduced to a distant, muffled hum. For a long moment, the general simply stood by the door, looking at Ilara, who remained standing rigidly in the center of the room, looking small and lost. Please sit down, Ilara, Walsh said, her voice quieter now, but still layered with an authority that brooked no refusal. She moved around to sit behind her desk, gesturing to the chair opposite. Ilara sat, perching on the very edge of the seat, her hands clenched together in her lap like a nervous child's. The general didn't speak immediately. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers, her gaze thoughtful and penetrating. I knew a Lieutenant Ilara Reverb Vance a long time ago, she began, her voice taking on a distant quality. Top of her class at Top Gun. One of the sharpest, most naturally gifted pilots I'd ever seen. She flew an F-14 Tomcat like it was part of her own nervous system. Then about 12 years ago she vanished. Left the Navy. Fell off the face of the earth. The official record was sparse. Resigned for personal reasons. Walsh's eyes focused back on the present, on the woman trembling slightly in the chair before her. The scuttlebutt, the stories, were a lot more colorful. Most involved some kind of colossal, career-ending mistake. A crash. A loss of a multi-million-dollar aircraft. A failure of nerve. She paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. I never knew what to believe. Until today. Ilara said nothing. She kept her eyes fixed on a small chip in the wood of the general's desk, her breath coming in shallow, quiet hitches. What happened out there today was not something you read in a manual, Walsh continued, her tone softening from interrogation to something closer to compassion. That was instinct born of experience. The kind of experience that only comes from having your hands on the stick when everything goes to hell. You didn't just know the systems, Ilara. You knew the feel of the failure. You knew the rhythm of the reboot. You knew the sound the relays would make. You were in that cockpit with them. She leaned forward, her elbows on the desk. I need to know. I have a right to know. Who is the woman who just saved 2 of my airmen? The legend? Or the failure the rumors talk about? The silence in the room was absolute. Ilara could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. The general's words, laced with neither accusation nor praise, but with a simple, stark demand for truth, were the chisel that finally broke the dam. The wall of silence she had maintained for 12 years crumbled. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, followed by another. She didn't sob, it was a quiet, profound collapse from within. Her voice, when it finally came, was a broken whisper, stripped of all its former authority, raw and ancient with pain. "It was my fault," she said, the words barely audible. "The rumors, they're right." She took a shuddering breath, her eyes still fixed on that chip in the wood, seeing not the desk but a different sky, a different cockpit. It was a training exercise over the Pacific. A high-risk intercept profile. I was lead. My wingman was a rookie, full of excitement, a little too eager. She swallowed hard. We encountered unexpected, severe clear-air turbulence at high altitude. It was a monster. It knocked us around like toys. My wingman's Tomcat, his older model, it went into an uncontrolled roll. He froze. I could hear the panic in his voice. Her own voice gained a little strength, haunted by the memory. I gave him an order. A specific, aggressive maneuver to counteract the roll. It was a known procedure, but it was risky. It required perfect timing. He hesitated for a half-second too long. Instead of correcting, his plane overstressed. I heard the sound over the radio, the sound of metal tearing itself apart. She closed her eyes, the memory vivid and punishing. He ejected. He survived. But his aircraft, a $70 million machine, was gone. Vanished into the ocean. She finally looked up, her eyes meeting the general's, filled with a bottomless well of guilt. The inquiry cleared me. They said it was pilot error on his part, an act of God, the turbulence. My order was technically correct. But it wasn't, don't you see? I knew his skill level. I knew he was green. I gave an order that required a level of skill he didn't have. I was showing off. I was Reverb, the hotshot. And because of my arrogance, because I needed to be the best, to have the perfect solution, I cost the Navy one of its aircraft and nearly cost a young man his life. The tears were flowing freely now, but her voice was steady with the grim clarity of a long-held truth. The humiliation wasn't from the Navy. It was from within. I couldn't look at a cockpit again. I couldn't bear the weight of that responsibility. So I left. I buried Reverb. I thought if I could just make the systems perfect, if I could engineer out the chance of human error, I could atone. I could hide behind a screen where my mistakes would only ever be lines of code. She gave a broken, hollow laugh. And then today, my code, my pride in my new systems, it almost killed 2 more men. History almost repeated itself. The failure always finds me. She fell silent, utterly spent, the confession hanging in the air between them, the full, tragic story of the ghost finally given voice. The silence in General Walsh's office was a living thing, thick and heavy with the weight of Alara's confession. It was not a silence of judgment, but of absorption, of processing a tragedy 12 years in the telling. The general's face, usually an unreadable mask of command, had softened. She looked at the broken woman before her not as a subordinate or a puzzle, but as a veteran carrying a wound that had never been allowed to heal. She was about to speak, to offer some measure of the absolution Alara had denied herself for over a decade, when the sharp, insistent buzz of her desk intercom shattered the moment. General Walsh, her assistant's voice crackled, strained and formal. Major Dillon is here. He is extremely insistent on seeing you immediately. Walsh's eyes flicked to Alara, who had stiffened at the name, fresh panic flashing in her red-rimmed eyes. The general's lips pressed into a thin line. This was a confrontation that needed to happen, but the timing was brutal. Send him in, she said, her voice resuming its customary steel. The door opened before the words had fully left her mouth. Major Jack Dillon filled the doorway. He was still in his flight suit, the material stained with sweat and smelling of jet fuel and cold fear. His helmet was tucked under his arm. But it was his face that was most transformed. The cocksure arrogance was utterly gone, sand-blasted away by the harrowing experience of his own mortality. In its place was a pale, hollowed-out shell of a man, his eyes wide with a dazed, uncomprehending shock. He looked like someone who had stared into an abyss and felt its cold breath on his face. He took 2 steps into the room, his eyes scanning, and then they locked onto Alara. For a long moment he just stared. He saw the woman he had derided as a desk jockey and a software nanny just hours before. He saw her red, tear-streaked face, the vulnerability in her posture. And he saw, superimposed over her, the cool, unwavering voice of salvation that had pulled him from the sky. The cognitive dissonance was so profound it was almost physical. His mouth opened but no sound came out. General Walsh watched him carefully. "Major," she said, her tone neutral, a commander establishing control of the room. "I trust you and Lieutenant Carter are unharmed." Dillon didn't seem to hear her. His gaze was fixed on Alara. "You," he finally managed, the word a choked whisper. "It was you. On the radio." It wasn't a question. It was a staggering realization. Alara couldn't meet his eyes. She looked down at her hands twisting together in her lap, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. This was the humiliation she had feared most, not the professional scrutiny, but the personal naked exposure of her failure to the very man whose life her past and present mistakes had nearly claimed. General Walsh decided to expedite the painful process. "Major Dillon," she said, her voice cutting through his stupor. "I have just been listening to a very illuminating account of today's events. And of events that transpired 12 years ago. It seems we have all been operating with a significant lack of information." She gestured to a second chair. "Sit down, Major." Dumbly, Dillon obeyed, collapsing into the chair as if his legs could no longer support him. He placed his helmet on the floor, his movements slow and robotic. "Before you say anything," Walsh continued, her tone leaving no room for argument, "you are going to listen. You are going to listen to the official report from the cockpit voice recorder and the telemetry data we managed to recover before the blackout." She turned to her computer, typed a few commands, and the speakers on her desk came to life. The recording was crystal clear, a chilling audio documentary of their near death. First, Dillon's own voice, loud and arrogant from that morning. "You code folks live in a world of what-ifs. We live in the sky. The jet is fine. We don't need a software nanny." Then the shift to the cockpit. The frantic, panicked calls between him and Carter as the systems failed. Dillon's own voice, stripped of all its confidence, raw with fear. "What the hell? I've got flight control errors. It's not responding." And then the new voice. Alara's voice but transformed. Calm, authoritative, impossibly precise. Raptor 1-1, this is Tower Auxiliary. Your flight control failure is a nested loop error. The recording played out the entire rescue, a step-by-step testament to her genius under pressure, punctuated by Dillon's own grunts of effort and Carter's relieved confirmations. It ended with Carter's emotional, grateful question. "Ma'am, who are you? You just saved our lives." General Walsh stopped the playback. The silence that returned was even heavier than before. Dillon sat motionless, his face ashen. He was not just hearing it, he was reliving it. He was hearing his own hubris, his own terror, and her stunning competence side by side. The contrast was devastating. He had been the master of the universe, right up until the moment the universe had shown him he was nothing but a passenger in a falling coffin. And she, the woman he had belittled, had been the only one with the knowledge and the nerve to reach into that coffin and wrench them free. General Walsh let him sit with the horrifying comparison for a long minute. Then she spoke, her voice low and severe. "The woman you called a desk jockey, Major, was once the best fighter pilot I had ever seen. Her call sign was Reverb. The flaw she warned you about was the very one that almost killed you. Your disregard for her expertise, your arrogance in overriding a signed-off safety protocol, directly caused the incident today. You are looking at the reason you are still alive. And you are also looking at a living lesson in why humility and respect for the experts around you are not optional. They are a matter of life and death." She didn't need to say anything more. The recording had been the indictment. Her words were the sentencing. Jack Dillon had not just been humbled by a near-death experience. He had been intellectually and professionally eviscerated. The foundation of his arrogance had been excavated, and the hole left behind was filled with a shame so profound it was a physical pain in his chest. He finally dragged his eyes from the floor and looked at Alara, truly looked at her, and for the first time he saw not a civilian contractor, but a legend he had been too blind to recognize. The walk from General Walsh's office was a journey through a different world. The same linoleum floors, the same hum of the ventilation system, the same uniformed personnel moving through the corridors. But for Major Jack Dillon, it was all rendered alien and grotesque by the lens of his own shame. He moved like a ghost, his body operating on autopilot, his mind a roaring static of recrimination. The confident, purposeful stride that had always announced his presence was gone, replaced by a shuffling, unmoored gait. He didn't see the salutes offered by junior officers. He didn't hear the murmured questions about his well-being. He was trapped in a loop, replaying the sound of his own arrogant dismissal in the morning and the sound of his own terrified voice begging a failing machine to respond in the afternoon. And over it all, the calm, steady voice of Alara Vance, the voice he had told to keep working at her desk, the voice that had held his life in its hands. He didn't know where he was going. His feet simply carried him, away from the command wing, away from the staring eyes, seeking the only place that had ever made sense to him. His squadron's ready room. He pushed the door open. The room was empty, silent. The familiar smells of stale coffee, leather, and ozone should have been a comfort. Instead, they felt like an accusation. This was a clubhouse for warriors, and he had proven himself a fool, not a warrior. His eyes scanned the room, falling on the scoresheet whiteboard where mock dogfight victories were tallied. His own call sign, Reaper, had the most marks. The sight of it now turned his stomach. What were those marks worth? They were childish scribbles next to the real score, which was now irrevocably written in the sky. His arrogance. 1. His aircrew's lives. 0. Saved only by a miracle he had actively mocked. He collapsed into a chair at the head of the table, the commander's chair. The leather sighed under his weight, a sound that seemed to echo his own internal deflation. He dropped his head into his hands, his fingers digging into his scalp. The image of Alara Vance in the general's office, raw and broken from confessing a 12-year-old pain, burned behind his eyelids. He had heaped his own brand of humiliation on top of hers, and she had still saved him. She had every right to hate him, to let him crash, to let the universe balance its books. Instead, she had reached across the abyss of his own making and pulled him back. The magnitude of that grace was a weight he knew he might never fully comprehend. For a long time he just sat there, motionless, in the silent, empty room. The bluster was gone. The entitlement was gone. All that was left was the cold, hard, naked truth. He had been wrong. Catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. And a good woman, a brilliant woman, had paid the price for his error twice over. The understanding didn't come as a flash of insight. It settled over him like a lead blanket, heavy and permanent. This was not a mistake to be learned from and moved past. This was a fundamental failing of character that would be seared into his identity forever. He was the commander who almost got his men killed because he couldn't listen to a civilian in a cardigan. The door to the ready room opened slowly. Lieutenant Ben Carter peered in, his face a mixture of concern and caution. "Reaper," he said softly. "They said you were in here." "Sir, are you okay?" Dylan didn't look up. His voice, when it came, was muffled by his hands, rough and stripped bare. "No, Chip. I am very far from okay." He finally raised his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, not from tears, but from a fatigue that went straight to the soul. "You heard it all. In the general's office." Carter stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. "I heard enough, sir." "Then you know," Dylan said, the words tasting like ash. "You know that it was my idiocy that put us in that cockpit today. My pride. I told her she was a software nanny. I told her to stick to her desk." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "And then she pulled us off the ceiling of the world with nothing but her voice. She saved us, Carter. After what I said to her." "Who does that?" "Someone a hell of a lot better than us, sir," Carter said quietly, without a trace of judgment. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "I've been doing some asking around. Since we landed. The old-timers, the ones who were here forever, they all know the name Reverb. They wouldn't say much, just that she was a legend. The best of the best. That she disappeared after a bad accident. That's it." He leaned forward, his young face earnest. "She's not just some engineer, sir. She's a hero. And we treated her like a secretary." Dylan nodded slowly, the truth of Carter's words sinking the knife of his shame even deeper. "A hero I tried to kill with my stupidity." He pushed himself up from the chair, the movement heavy with a new resolve. The paralysis of shame was beginning to crystallize into a clear, painful duty. "It's not enough to just feel this, Carter. It's not enough to know it. I have to make it right. Or try to. I don't know how, but I have to try." He looked at the young WSO who had faced death with more courage than he had. "The apology to the general, the one she'll expect, that's just words on a report. It means nothing." He took a deep, shuddering breath, the weight of his next decision settling on his shoulders. "The only apology that matters is to her. And it can't be official. It has to be real." He knew what he had to do. The thought filled him with a dread far greater than any missile lock ever had, but he knew it was the only path forward. He had to find Alara Vance. The base, usually a place of regimented order and predictable noise, felt like an alien landscape to Alara Vance. Every sound was too loud, every glance from a passing airman felt like an accusation or worse, a moment of awestruck recognition. The cocoon of anonymity she had spun so carefully over 12 long years had been torn away in a single violent afternoon, leaving her exposed and raw. She couldn't go back to her office. It was a crime scene of her past life. She couldn't go home. The silence there would be filled with the echoes of jet engines and a young man's panic from 12 years ago. Her feet, acting on a desperate instinctual need for a neutral, quiet space, carried her to the one place on base designed for solace, the hospital. She didn't go to the emergency wing, where the adrenaline of the day would still be buzzing. Instead, she found her way to a quieter corridor on the third floor, to an office with a nameplate that read Dr. Anya Sharma, base psychologist. Anya was a friend, the closest thing Elara had to a confidant, though even she had only ever known the carefully edited version of Elara Vance, engineer. Elara pushed the door open without knocking. Anya looked up from her paperwork, her warm brown eyes initially curious, then immediately concerned as she took in Elara's pale, shaken appearance. "Elara? Good heavens, what's wrong? I heard about the emergency landing, are you hurt?" Anya said, rising from her chair. Elara just shook her head, unable to form words. She sank into the comfortable chair opposite Anya's desk, pulling her cardigan tightly around herself as if she were freezing. Anya didn't press. She quietly got up, poured a glass of water from a pitcher on a side table, and placed it in front of Elara before taking her seat again. She waited, her presence a calm, patient anchor in the storm of Elara's turmoil. The story came out in fits and starts, a fractured, emotional torrent. She told Anya everything. The morning's confrontation with Dylan. The sickening feeling when the Mayday call came in. The terrifying, automatic shift into her old self as she guided the jet down. The exposure in the operations center. The confession in General Walsh's office. The weight of the old guilt, now compounded by the new, and the crushing humiliation of having her deepest failure laid bare for the entire base to see. She spoke for a long time, and when she was finally done, she was drained, empty, the glass of water untouched before her. Anya listened without interruption, her expression one of deep empathy. When Elara fell silent, she leaned forward. "Elara," she said softly, "what I hear you describing is not a failure. You faced a moment of absolute crisis, and you reached into the deepest part of your being, into a place of profound pain, and you used that pain to save 2 lives. That is not a failure. That is extraordinary courage." Before Elara could respond, a soft knock sounded at the door. Both women looked up. The door opened slowly and Major Jack Dillon stood there. He looked utterly diminished. The flight suit was gone, replaced by a standard duty uniform, but it hung on him differently. His shoulders were slumped, his usually proud head was bowed. He looked nothing like the arrogant commander from that morning. In his hands he held his officer's cover, his hat, turning it over and over in a nervous, repetitive motion. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice hoarse and tentative. "Dr. Sharma. I apologize for the intrusion. May I speak with you for a moment? Please?" The "please" was barely a whisper, a word that seemed foreign on his lips. Anya looked at Elara, a question in her eyes. Elara, after a moment's hesitation, gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Dylan stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. He didn't approach the desk. He stood just inside the doorway as if not granting himself the right to come any closer. He looked at Elara, and the shame in his eyes was so raw and deep it was painful to witness. "General Walsh, she made me listen to the recording," he began, his voice low and thick with emotion. "All of it. From this morning. From the cockpit." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I heard myself. I heard the things I said to you. I heard the contempt in my voice. And then I heard the fear. My fear." He paused, gathering himself, his knuckles white as he gripped his hat. "And then I heard your voice. And I cannot, there are no words to describe what that was like. To be falling out of the sky, utterly helpless, and to have that voice come out of nowhere. A voice that knew. A voice that wasn't afraid. A voice that was smarter and braver than I could ever hope to be." He took a shaky breath. "I am not here to make excuses. There are none. I am here to apologize. Not because the general ordered me to, but because I need to. I was arrogant. I was dismissive. I was a fool. I treated your expertise, your experience like it was nothing. And my arrogance almost killed 2 of my crewmen. It would have if not for you." His eyes finally met hers, and they were shining with unshed tears of remorse. "You saved our lives, Miss Vance. After what I said to you. After how I treated you. You saved us anyway. I don't know how to ever repay that. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for it." He fell silent, standing there in the middle of the room, completely vulnerable, completely stripped of his rank and his ego, offering nothing but the raw, unvarnished truth of his failure and his gratitude. It was the most real, most humbling thing Alara had ever witnessed. The angry, defensive wall she had built around herself began to crack. This wasn't a forced, formal apology. This was a man who had been broken open and was showing her the pieces. Before she could form a response, another figure appeared at the still open doorway. Lieutenant Ben Carter, still looking young and a bit shell-shocked, but his expression was one of pure, unwavering admiration. He held a small, simple potted plant with a single, bright bloom. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clear and respectful. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I wanted to bring you this. It's not much, but thank you. For my life." He placed the plant gently on a small table near the door, then came to attention and rendered a sharp, perfect salute, not to her rank for she had none, but to her person, to her courage, to the legend of Reverb and the woman who had been her. He held the salute for a long, respectful moment, then turned and left, leaving silence in his wake. Alara looked from the sincere, grief-stricken apology of the major to the simple, profound gratitude of the lieutenant. The two halves of her torment, the cause of the crisis and the life saved from it, were both here, offering not humiliation but respect. The ice around her heart, frozen for 12 years, began to thaw. A single, quiet tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of pain this time, but of a long-forgotten feeling, a fragile, tentative sense of peace. The days that followed were a strange, slow-motion readjustment to a world that was fundamentally the same, yet utterly different. The sun still rose over the desert, baking the tarmac. The low hum of the climate control in the engineering wing remained a constant. But for Alara Vance, the silence was no longer a shield. It was simply silence. The weight she had carried for 12 years, a leaden cloak of guilt and shame, had not vanished, but its texture had changed. It was no longer a secret burden. It was a story that had been told, witnessed, and in the profound apologies of Major Dillon and the pure gratitude of Lieutenant Carter, somehow, acknowledged. The humiliation had been scorching, a fire that burned away the false identity she had constructed. But from the ashes, something quieter, more resilient, was beginning to emerge. She returned to her office. The code was still on her screens, the algorithms waiting. But she looked at them now not as a hiding place but as tools. The ghost of Reverb was no longer a specter to be feared. It was a part of her, a deep well of experience she could draw from without drowning in it. She found she could think about aircraft systems, about flight envelopes and failure points, without the accompanying flash of memory that would send her reeling. The past was integrated, a painful chapter but no longer the definition of her entire book. A week after the incident, a formal meeting was called in General Walsh's office. Alara was summoned. When she arrived, Major Dillon was already there, standing stiffly at attention. The atmosphere was formal but not hostile. General Walsh got straight to the point. "The investigation is closed," she stated, her hands folded on the desk. "The findings are clear." A software patch was loaded against the strong recommendation of the lead engineer. That patch contained a critical flaw that led to a near-catastrophic systems failure. The actions of civilian contractor Alara Vance prevented the loss of a $300 million aircraft and the lives of 2 airmen. She looked at Dillon. "Major, your actions were a severe error in judgment. Your record will reflect this. There will be disciplinary measures, including a formal reprimand and mandatory leadership retraining. Your arrogance cost this base dearly. It is only through sheer luck and the exceptional skill of Ms. Vance that you are not facing a court-martial." Dillon nodded, his face grim but accepting. "Understood, General. I accept full responsibility." Walsh then turned to Alara. Her expression softened a fraction. "Ms. Vance, this base and the United States Air Force owes you a debt it can likely never repay. A formal commendation has been drafted. However," she paused, "I am aware that you value your privacy. I am also aware that a piece of paper and a medal are poor currency for what you did. So I am offering you something else. A choice." Alara looked at her, curious. "We have a problem," Walsh continued. "Our pilots are the best in the world. They are masters of their aircraft. But they are masters of it when it works. Their training for systemic, complex failures is theoretical. It's based on manuals. What happened to Major Dillon and Lieutenant Carter proved that those manuals are not enough. We need someone who can teach them what a failure feels like. Someone who can get inside their heads and teach them how to think when every alarm is screaming and the sky is falling. We need someone who has been there." She leaned forward. I am offering you a position as a special consultant. Part-time. Your sole purpose would be to design and teach a new emergency procedures and systems failure management course. You would not be required to fly. You would work from the ground, using simulators, your knowledge, and your experience to harden our crews against the unexpected. You would be, for all intents and purposes, a teacher. The teacher we desperately need. The offer hung in the air. It was not a return to the cockpit. It was not a resurrection of Reverb. It was something new. It was a way to use the pain of her past, the brilliance of her mind, and the hard-won lessons of her failure to protect others. It was a path to atonement that didn't require hiding. It required stepping into the light on her own terms. Ilara looked from the general's earnest face to Dylan's. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. He knew better than anyone now what her knowledge was worth. She took a deep, slow breath, feeling the rightness of it settle into her bones. I accept, she said, her voice clear and steady. I would be honored to try. The journey of Ilara Vance teaches us that our greatest failures do not have to define us, but they can refine us. That true strength is found not in hiding our scars, but in using them to guide and protect others. Her story is a powerful reminder that redemption is always possible, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is not to forget the past, but to make peace with it and allow it to make us better. If you found value in this story of humility, discovery, and courage, consider subscribing for more narratives that explore the profound lessons hidden within the human experience. Your support helps us continue to share tales that not only entertain but also inspire and remind us of our shared humanity.